and welcome back. I'm Denise and this is the Convict Diaries. Today we'll be making another entry in the Convict Diaries. This one is in regards to the gang known as Cash and Co. Martin Cash, Lawrence Kavanaugh and George Jones didn't walk, but they swam into bushranging history. From escape to capture, their adventures lasted only months. Yet during these months, they became celebrities. They caused panic and fear to some and earned the respect and loyalty of others. Their skill at escaping frustrated the law and those that wanted them caught. Celebrated as the head of the gang was Martin Cash. He was baptised in 1808 and he was the son of a fairly well-to-do couple, George and Margaret Cash. Born in County Wexford, Ireland, he was fortunate enough to achieve a reasonable standard of education. At about 18 years of age, he met a young woman who made her living making hats and bonnets from straw. I guess she realised that he was well off and generous as she began to take advantage of their friendship. She and her family began borrowing money from him. His mother was not amused watching her resources being wasted. She told him to stop his extravagance. So Cash managed to find work as a farm boy in Wexford. In his memoirs, Cash claimed that the crime that brought him about his transportation was the wounding of a man named Jessup. He claimed that in a jealous rage he had shot Jessup through a house window because Jessup had been making advances to Cash's sweetheart Mary. He also claimed that the ball wounded his rival in the buttocks. However, records report that in March 1827 he was convicted of housebreaking. No matter what the reason, he ended up sentenced to 7 years transportation to the penal settlement. He and around 170 others boarded the Marquis of Huntly and it left from Cork Harbour, arriving in Sydney town on the 10th of February 1828. Cash found himself assigned as a stockman to George Bowman, a free settler whose parents had arrived in the colony in 1798. His father John settled on the Hawkesbury River. Bowman had taken up grants and purchased property, amassing quite a large lot of land, in and around the Hunter Valley. Cash continued to work for him after his ticket of leave. So one day an acquaintance, John Boodle, whose property was located on the Liverpool Plains, asked Cash to help him and his brothers brand some cattle. While Cash and his mates were busy branding the animals, two strangers came along. They stayed only a brief minute. Cash claims that he was ignorant to the fact that the cattle did not belong to his friend, and when Boodle informed Cash that the strangers knew the cows were stolen, he was stunned. Cash knew that the penalty for the crime of cattle duffing was a trip to Norfolk Island, and as a result he also knew that he had to avoid being sent there. You see, Norfolk Island is an island situated in the Pacific Ocean between Australia and New Zealand. At this point in history, the island had only recently been re-established as an extension of the penal settlement. It was a place where they sent the supposedly most hardcore convicts. Its remoteness, which was originally seen as a problem, now was seen as an advantage for the detention of uncooperative and obstinate male prisoners. This glorious, idyllic paradise had become a place of nightmares and had become well known as Hell in the Pacific. So his only option, it seemed, was to escape and get away from his troubles. He moved with his common law wife Bessie Clifford to Van Diemen's Land, arriving on the 10th of February 1837 on board the Francis Freeling. Though it seems Cash could not stay out of trouble. He eventually came before John Giles Price, a magistrate at Hobart Town. He was sentenced to 2 years in addition to his original 7-year sentence, and to 4 years imprisonment with hard labour at Port Arthur. Port Arthur, on the Tasman Peninsula, southeast of Hobart, was a maximum security prison. Notorious for its harsh conditions and considered escape-proof, it could only be reached by ship or along a narrow peninsula. Fierce dogs were chained within a few inches of each other, and armed guards were posted on the peninsula. The prisoners were told that the waters on both sides were dangerous and shark-infested, so escape was impossible. 2 years later, he was convicted of larceny and again sentenced to 7 years. In the next 3 years, he escaped Port Arthur, the so-called escape-proof colony, 3 times. His first attempt at escape failed. However, he was perhaps the first person that managed to swim across the supposedly shark-infested Eaglehawk Neck. He earned great respect from the other prisoners due to this success. George Jones was the second member of Cash's gang. George was born in about 1850 in London, England. In 1829 he was working as an errand boy and living in London. On the 20th of March that year, Jones was tried at Surrey Assizes for robbing a till and sentenced to transportation for life. George Jones and 179 other convicts were transported to New South Wales aboard the Dunvegan Castle. They arrived in Sydney on the 13th of March 1830. On arrival, he was assigned to Richard Lang on the Hunter River in the Newcastle district. According to Jones's convict records, he had bouts of angry defiance and disobedience. In June of 1833, he stole grapes and received 25 lashes. In May 1835, 50 lashes for disobedience, and 100 lashes in September for neglect of duty. In March 1837, Jones received 50 lashes for absconding. In 1841, George Jones was assigned to Captain John Pike of Pickering Farm near Merton, because the 25th of May 1841 he absconded. It's well known that Pike was a harsh master, and he kept his convict servants under deplorable conditions. He met up with the tattooed escaped convict Joseph Bowers, and they teamed up. Joseph had escaped from service of William Blaxland of Cassillis in June 1841. In January 1842, Jones and Bowers, brandishing double-barrelled guns, held up 2 men, Superintendent of Buchanan's machine run near Massabook, John Lucas, and a man named Cotterill. They compelled both men to get off their horses and walk them about 40 yards into the bush. Jones and Bowers fleeced them of what little money they had. Cotterill and Lucas remained their captives until dark. Before they were freed, both men had their horses returned to them, and Lucas was handed back 5 shillings to pay for his bed. The next morning, the 2 bushrangers held up the mail cart travelling from Muswellbrook. They took the driver and passenger captive and took them and the mail into the bush away from the road. The outlaws opened the mail bags as well as the mail inside. Their captives reported that they were very merry and jocular. Afterwards, the bushrangers shared some fresh tea with their prisoners, and then Jones and Bowers rode off. It was Monday the 24th of January when George Jones walked into the commercial bank in Sydney town, pretty soon after it opened its doors. He was there to present a cheque to be cashed. The bank officer informed him that he would need to go to the police office so that he could account for how these cheques came into his possessions. Jones agreed and went with him. At the Central Police Office, Jones, having told a made-up story and given an assumed name, was instructed that he would need to prepare an affidavit. So he did. Some of the details in the affidavit aroused the suspicion of the police, and they detained him. Searching him, they found 30 bank cheques and orders totalling around £171. Jones was trapped. He admitted that he had took the cheques and orders from the stolen letters that he had found in the Muswellbrook mailbag. When he was asked why, for goodness sake, would he go to the police station, he replied that he knew it was neck or nothing, and if he did not get the cheques and orders cashed, then there was no use in doing the job. Jones had been on the loose for around 8 months. Joseph Bowers was apprehended in late January in Castlereagh Street in Sydney on suspicion of being a runaway. So Jones and Bowers found themselves in Hyde Park Barracks Court waiting a trial. In late February, their tickets of leave were cancelled. On Monday, the 4th of April, at the Sydney Court of Quarter Sessions, Jones and Bowers were indicted on charges of highway and mail robbery and being illegally at large with firearms in their possession. They were formally identified by John Lucas as the men who had bailed him up on January 17th. Both men were sentenced to transportation for life. The third member of the gang was Lawrence Kavanaugh. He was born around 1810 in County Wicklow. In 1828, he and his eldest sister Catherine were convicted of burglary in Dublin. They were both sentenced to death, commuted to transportation for life. Lawrence Kavanaugh was transported to New South Wales aboard the Ferguson with 40 other convicts, arriving in Sydney on the 26th of March 1829. Just as a side note, Catherine was transported to New South Wales, departing the 1st of January 1829. She travelled on board the Edward, arriving on the 26th of April 1829. She was listed as a single Catholic with one child, convicted of house robbery. She had received a life sentence. She received permission to marry John Fox. Back to Lawrence. Lawrence Kavanaugh was assigned to work for Edward Riley at Raby in the Campbelltown area, southwest of Sydney. In February 1832, Kavanaugh received 40 lashes for insolence and disorderly conduct. He was assigned to road gangs from September 1832. He absconded from the number 20 road gang. On the 8th of February 1833, Lawrence and Dominic McCoy appeared before the Campbelltown Court of Sessions. They were charged with assaulting Martin Grady with the intent to rob him. It was reported that Kavanaugh, McCoy, and a third man had stopped Grady's cart as he was driving on the Liverpool Road and assaulted him with sticks. Grady attempted to defend himself and drew a pair of sharp shears from his pocket. The unnamed attacker was unharmed and quickly made his escape. Kavanaugh and McCoy, on the other hand, were wounded before they managed to escape. Once captured, both men were tried and found guilty and sentenced to transportation for 14 years. Kavanaugh was sent to the Phoenix prison hulk and then transported to Norfolk Island in March 1833. It's not clear if he returned as a free man, but by January he had returned to Sydney. Because on the 19th of January 1842, Kavanaugh received 36 lashes for cutting his iron. Following this, on January 27th, Kavanaugh and another convict, Thomas Brown, escaped from the watchhouse at the Hyde Park Barracks. The two men reached Double Bay and stole a fishing boat. During this incident, they threatened the life of a female who tried to stop them. The next day, it was reported that the two men had robbed the house of a Mrs. Raby. She was the mother-in-law of Captain Innes at Lane Cove, and amongst the items stolen was a musket. So a reward was offered for the apprehension of either of the absconders. £10 would be the reward for any free person, while to a prisoner of the Crown the reward offered was the allowance of a conditional pardon. In the Australasian Chronicle, published 10th of February 1842, his description was height 5 feet 7.5 inches, complexion ruddy, fresh, his hair brown, his eyes blue, with a flat nose. He was missing his right little finger, had a small scar on the back of his left hand and on the centre of his forehead. He was described as 26 years old. The men established a hideout on the north shore of the harbour where they had concealed the articles they had stolen. For a very short period of time, the men were committing robberies and such in the Sydney area and moving freely around the harbour. On February 11th, 3 men, one of them later identified as Kavanaugh, holding a musket, flew out of the bush in front of the Colonial Secretary, Edward Dees Thompson, with Captain William Hunter, Eddie Manning and Dr. Doble, who were enjoying a ride together along the beach at Rose Bay. The riders hastened their horses in order to escape more quickly. One of the men yelled to Hunter, "If you don't stop, by God, we'll shoot you." When Captain Hunter showed no sign of stopping, Kavanaugh fired 2 shots, but both missed him. So now the mounted police and constables were sent off in various directions to scour the bush. The following day, a group of 4 mounted police and an Aborigine, searching in the vicinity of Watson's Bay, discovered some footprints. They were able to trace the men to a small cave where they found Kavanaugh and Brown, as well as another man named Joseph Johnston, and a woman dressed in men's clothes, a runaway assigned servant of Mr. Nowler named Elizabeth Kelly. The police took their 4 captives to the Darlinghurst jail. On the 12th of April 1842, Kavanaugh, Brown and Johnson appeared before the New South Wales Supreme Court, charged with illegally possessing firearms and having feloniously shot at William Hunter with intent to murder him. The men pleaded not guilty. After the prosecution had presented its case, Lawrence Kavanaugh spoke in his own defence. He claimed he had never intended to do acts of personal violence when he took to the bush, but he was compelled to do so by the tyranny he had experienced while he Hyde Park Barracks, adding that the tyranny he had endured at Norfolk Island was nothing to that which he had experienced in Sydney. The jury returned guilty verdicts without leaving the box. The 3 men convicted were sentenced to be transported to Van Diemen's Land for life. On the 30th of May 1842, Lawrence Kavanaugh, George Jones, along with 41 other prisoners of the Crown, including Joseph Bower, were transported from Sydney to Van Diemen's Land aboard the schooner Marion Watson, arriving at Hobart on June the 8th. From there, Jones and Kavanaugh were taken to the Port Arthur settlement. It was here that the 3 men met and Cash and Company was formed as they planned their escape. It was Boxing Day 1842 when the 3 men absconded from a work party. Hiding in dense scrubland and with little food, they made their way 15 kilometres, 9.3 miles, to the Neck. They attempted to swim with their clothes tied in bundles above their heads. Unfortunately, they lost their bundles. But they made the other side. Now naked, the trio robbed a road ganger's hut, for clothing, and began an 8-month spree of bushranging. They immediately sought out properties of the rich, homesteads, hotels, and unsuspecting travellers, creating fear and consternation across the state. They were involved in several dramatic shootouts, which only enhanced their notorious reputation. Their status grew amongst the lesser classes, whom they left alone, and their deeds were seen much as a Robin Hood adventure, where they took from the rich but didn't distribute to the poor. Heading in a northwesterly direction, they arrived at a bush hut, where they stole bread, tea, sugar, and a billy from the scared occupants. When they reached a more populous district in the vicinity of Sorrel, they selected a farmhouse and kept watch on it during the day. When nightfall came, they forced entry by knocking on the door and calling out police. Kavanaugh took possession of a gun, and each man found a complete change of clothes. At a shepherd's hut near Prosser Plains, the convicts obtained a second gun. By 19th of January 1843, a reward had been proclaimed. The reward offered for the apprehension of either of the felons, 50 sovereigns, if their services be performed by a convict. A conditional pardon would be granted in addition to the reward. They were moving northwest still when they raided Blinkworth's house in the Richmond district on the 23rd of January 1843. They got some food here, as well as taking possession of a double-barreled shotgun. Next, Cash, Kavanaugh and Jones bailed up a public house near Baghdad, a small town 37 kilometres north of Hobart. One of the men under guard managed to escape while they were searching the premises, necessitating a speedy retreat and a resolution to better secure each person in the future. The following morning, now moving southwest, they bailed up Elijah Payton and his family at their farmhouse, causing great distress to Payton's pregnant wife Jane. The intruders then secured a group of labourers from an outhouse, as well as the household servants, before searching and plundering the contents of the house. On the road, the 3 bushrangers passed Dr. McDowell. He claimed that the 3 men had fired upon him. The unfortunate Payton, who was a former convict, received a letter from the Colonial Secretary informing him that because the bushrangers were allowed to escape from his house, he is to be deprived of all his assigned servants. The Woolpack Inn was located on the Hamilton Road in Macquarie Plains, 12 miles northwest of New Norfolk, and was built in 1829. The building was demolished in 1936. On Tuesday evening, 31st of January 1843, the 3 men arrived. They bailed up the publican's wife, Mrs. Stoddart, her 2 adult sons, as well as 3 customers. Mrs. Stoddart did not inform Cash that 4 police constables were stationed in the hut about 50 yards from the public house, despite his inquiry. The constables had noticed that something was wrong at the hotel. At one point, Cash gazed out of the window and perceived some people moving up to the house. He informed his companions. Cash stepped out of the building and was told to stand by the approaching men. Cash immediately fired his weapon, and Kavanaugh and Jones, standing either side of him, also fired, wounding 2 of the policemen. Cash later claimed that the policemen who had behaved in a cowardly manner as they dove for cover. After the smoke cleared, Cash found himself alone. Kavanaugh and Jones had taken the opportunity to escape. Cash returned to the house and grabbed a 3-gallon keg of brandy before he too made his escape. He joined his comrades at the spot where they had previously stashed their swags. The 3 men set up camp at Mount Dromedary between Brighton and New Norfolk in the Black Hills area. In his memoirs, Cash refers to the elevated station as a fortress, which he named Dromedary Park. It was here the 3 men travelled to after the shootout. They stopped at Henry Cawthon's property at the foot of Mount Dromedary, tying up several men and raiding the house to obtain provisions, as well as a gun and ammunition. They had heard a rumour that the constables and military were closing in on them, so they decided it was time to lay low. They spent the night at the home of one of Cash's old acquaintances, an ex-convict named Thomas Blackburn and his wife Hannah, who were living at Cobb's Hill. The following day, Hannah Blackburn travelled to Hobart Town and returned with Cash's de facto wife, Eliza, after having dodged police surveillance. The 3 Bushrangers, accompanied by Eliza, then returned to their base camp at nearby Mount Dromedary. Kavanaugh, Cash, Jones, and Eliza spent the next 3 days in quiet retirement, enjoying the beauties of nature unadorned by art. However, with their supplies running low, the Bushrangers resolved to take the field and levy contributions, leaving Eliza in charge of the fortress. On Tuesday, the 7th of February, 1843, the 3 convicts went to the house of Hodgkinson, his wife and 18-year-old daughter, while Jones covered the captives with a double-barreled shotgun. Kavanaugh searched for food and other supplies. Meanwhile, Cash remained outside and stood watch. The lady of the house was a handful. She verbally abused the intruders and attempted to escape from the house several times. She screamed at the intruders at the top of her voice until they were out of her sight. Saturday, February the 11th, the 3 men suddenly entered the house of Collis Farm in the bush near the road to Brighton, 17 miles north of Hobart Town. Mrs. Collis fed the 3 men with mutton and Cape wine, and then afterwards they locked her and her young child in the storeroom and left. They took with them some clothes, food, and the remainder of the wine. Cash, Kavanaugh, and Jones stopped 4 men in a cart near near Thomas Shone's 300-acre property in the Back River district, north-east of New Norfolk, on Wednesday, February the 22nd. They tied up the men and proceeded to the house. Each of the outlaws were armed with a double-barrel fowling piece and a brace of pistols. The Bushrangers held Shone, his wife, and a guest, and after a while they were joined by other members of the household and their guests when a spring cart arrived at the house. The Bushrangers also tied up 7 men from a nearby hut and brought them to the house. A total of 19 people were held in one room. The Bushrangers spent about an hour before departing on foot with food and valuables. As a result of allowing the Bushrangers to escape, Thomas Shone was later informed that he would be deprived of his assigned servants. This decision was later the subject of criticism and ridicule by the press. The King's Own Light Infantry, under the command of Major Ainsworth, were given the task of pursuing the convicts several days later. From their elevated position at their camp at Mount Dromedary, they could watch the parties of police and military scouring the country, searching for them, taking all directions but the right one. Eliza was returned to Hobart Town because Cash became concerned for her safety. After her departure, the three men decided to change their location and move further inland to the north, to the districts around Hamilton. In response to the widespread belief that the Bushrangers were being aided and supported by convicts, on the 1st of March 1843, the colonial government amended the reward offered to a convict for the apprehension of the three runaways from Port Arthur. It was announced that any convict who shall apprehend or give information that would lead to the apprehension of any of the three men would receive a free pardon, as well as passage from the colony, and a reward of 50 sovereigns. From as early as February 1843, the colonial newspapers had begun to use the shorthand term Cash and Co. to describe the three bushrangers. The term became increasingly common as their exploits increased, and they remained at large. Yet it would seem that there was some doubt as to who the actual leader of the gang, with mistaken identity probably playing a part. The Bushrangers were pretty busy in the Hamilton and Bothwell districts. It was Saturday, March the 11th, when the three bushrangers visited the residence of Thomas Triffitt at Green Hills on the River Ouse. They robbed it of everything they could carry away. They took his gun and left behind one that they deemed inferior that he had stolen earlier. They asked Triffitt to return it to its rightful owner. 8 days later, on Sunday, March the 19th, the Bushrangers arrived at the station of Charles Kerr, Dunroban, about 14 miles from Hamilton, after observing the place for 2 days beforehand. They left with a pair of dueling pistols, some clothes, and a telescope to aid their careful observation of human movement. On the following Wednesday, the Bushrangers paid a visit to John Sherwin of Sherwood Station between Hamilton and Bothwell, an incursion which followed a familiar pattern. Heading southeast, the three bushrangers struck next on March the 25th at Thomas Eddle's house. Cash shot a large dog which attacked them. They broke the door in and found Eddles and his family members inside. The Eddles had prepared for an incursion, and the bushrangers found loaded guns behind the door and a pair of dueling pistols. Mr. Eddles later added a little insight into the three bushrangers. He commented that Cash is represented as a low-speaking, foul-mouthed man, Kavanaugh the most quiet of the three, and Jones the most intelligent. March 29th, the Bushrangers arrived at Captain Clark's hunting ground, near Green Ponds. They found that the house was occupied by 3 ladies and a woman servant only, so they left after only a short time, taking only a newspaper and some apples. Later that very same day, the outlaws robbed John Thompson's house. They turned up a half an hour after a party of soldiers and constables had left the farm. On April 15th, Cash and Company robbed George Stockwell's farmhouse at the Tears near Mount Jerusalem, northwest of Bothwell. They represented themselves as constables in search of the bushrangers. After a breakfast of ham and eggs, the outlaws left, taking provisions and a few items of clothing, including the overseer's boots. Wednesday, April 26th, the bushrangers, described by Magistrate John Clark as having miserably haggard appearances, badly clothed and with scarcely a shoe on their foot, bailed him up while riding on the road near Bothwell, and forced him to go with them to the Allardyce's homestead on the River Clyde, where they stole clothing and provisions and 2 guns and ammunition. By this time it was generally believed that the career of Cash & Co. was drawing to a close. A newspaper had stated a fortnight earlier the opinion that, hemmed in on all sides, miserably jaded, restless, and apprehensive, they will fall easy victims to the first party they encounter. On Tuesday, the 9th of May, they raided Elsby's station at Bashan Plains, 18 miles northwest of Bothwell, taking away provisions as well as a couple of horses to carry their plunder. May 19th, the Bushrangers held up Captain Mackay on the River Dee. After dining with him, in company with his neighbour Thomas Gellibrand, they loaded 2 horses with provisions and travelled with their captives the 3 miles to Gellibrand's Run, where they loaded a 3rd horse and departed. It was surmised that the outlaws were now stocked up for winter, and would head for the winter quarters, and stay quiet for some time. This was partially correct. Cash, Kavanaugh and Jones spent the remainder of May and the first week of June, 1843, at Mount Dromedary, or with the Blackburns at nearby Cobb Hill. In late May, after the discovery of their stash of stolen supplies, including horses, saddles and bridles, were found in a deep ravine, a newspaper report of the discovery said the Bushrangers' supplies concluded with the following comments. So instead of going quietly as they proposed into winter quarters, they will be compelled to enter in active operations, a course which will render their capture certain. So vigilant are their present pursuers. On the evening of Wednesday, June the 21st, they bailed up the halfway house, which was an inn kept by Edward Greenbank, on the road between Oatlands and Ross, at a rural locality called Anthill Ponds. After their departure, Greenbank asked his ticket of leave servant to ride to Oatlands and report the incident. So the Bushrangers went directly to William Kimberley's homestead 2 miles to the east. They shot the lock off and entered the house to find a constable in the process of exiting through a window. The outlaws left the property very quickly, as they were afraid that there was an ambush. They made their way to a nearby hut belonging to Samuel Smith, one of Cash's old acquaintances, leaving their knapsacks by the door before entering. The occupants asked the Bushrangers to join them in a drink. Then they heard a voice from outside. "Surround the hut, we have them. Here's their swag." A party of 7 soldiers, 3 constables, sent from Oatlands, had caught up with them at the hut. A gunfight ensued. The Bushrangers gathered their arms, put out the light, and left the hut, firing as they went. More than 100 shots were fired in the exchange between the parties, resulting in one of the soldiers receiving a slight wound. In Cash's words, "This was merely random firing. The darkness of the night prevented us from seeing each other. Neither had either side the wish to get in close quarters." The 3 outlaws laid low in the bush while the constables searched for them in the dark. Late in the morning of Saturday, June the 24th, Lawrence Kavanaugh walked up to a landholder on the River Isis and asked for the master. The man was Christopher Gattenby, and he informed the stranger that he was the master. Kavanaugh unbuttoned his greatcoat, pointed to the pair of pistols in his belt, and then the bushranger accompanied Gatenby to his house, where they ate dinner, drank several bottles of wine, acting with politeness throughout and treating the ladies with great respect. Afterwards Gatenby and two of his men carried parcels of clothes and provisions and departed, heading into the foot. It was reported that the three bushrangers were in a half-famished state. The men spent 3 days camping on the Lake River. Then the bushrangers headed east towards the Macquarie River. They had been informed that the farmhouses along the way had a police presence. Traps were set all over the place in an effort to capture the bushrangers, and they were vigilant. On June the 30th, the boys approached the Cairns residence on the Lake River. They saw or heard something that seemed to indicate a trap, so they headed back to the scrub. There was a party of constables stationed in the house, and they ran out after them. A small gunfight followed. The outlaws managed to escape, but had to abandon the supplies they had taken from Gatenby. The three men found themselves very tired and short of supplies when they arrived at J. Mule's property on the Macquarie River, where they went to visit another acquaintance of Cash, a shepherd. They had been spotted by men working on the neighbouring property. These men decided to arm themselves and follow the bushrangers. Their intention was to capture them. Once again there was a firefight later that evening at the shepherd's hut. The prospective captors retreated. The gang gathered some provisions and crossed the Macquarie River to camp for the night. Late in the morning of Monday, July the 3rd, the three bushrangers bailed up the Launceston coach on the main road near Epping Forest, northwest of Campbelltown, and robbed the passengers. Once again, the description of the outlaws was sad, a squalid and miserable appearance, and exhibiting great haste and trepidation. During the robbery, the coach was detained for only about 10 minutes, during which Mrs. Cox, the coach proprietor, rebuked them in severe terms for their wickedness and folly of their career. The reward for the capture of either of the bushrangers was raised on the 5th of July 1843 to 100 acres of land, a pardon and passage from the colonial colony previously offered. But if the person entitled to the reward was a convict, the monetary reward would be the sole option. The three convicts walked through the bush, avoiding towns until they were near Ross, a township 7 miles south of Campbelltown. On Friday evening, July 7th, they broke into the home of Captain Samuel Horton. Horton's cook, William Jackson, an assigned servant, was shot in the shoulder during the incursion. The bushrangers' overall conduct was described as extremely violent, having several times rushed at Captain Horton in a ferocious way, menacing to shoot him if he did not find them money. During these events, Horton's wife managed to escape, so the outlaws were forced to depart in haste. After the three outlaws left the Horton home, they sought a hiding place, but there were parties hot on their heels. They headed for the wilderness area of the lakes. Along the way, they bailed up a shepherd's hut at a place called Dog's Head and obtained some rations for their trip. They were making their way across a mass of limestone rock near Sorrel when Lawrence Kavanaugh stumbled and fell. His firearm discharged when it hit a rock. The ball entered Kavanagh's arm at the elbow, followed the bone, and exited from the wrist. They took care of Kavanagh's arm with a torn-up white shirt. Kavanaugh felt faint but could walk, so the bushrangers decided to return in the direction of Bothwell. Their plan was to enter the township after dark, abduct the doctor. But that evening when they camped, Kavanaugh told them he was determined to give himself up to the magistrate. The other two entreated him to change his mind, but to no avail. The next morning they escorted Kavanaugh close to the magistrate's place, and then they parted company. In his memoir, Cash suggests that Jones requested that they shoot Kavanaugh. Cash claims he rebuked Jones, telling him he regretted very much to hear him suggest anything so unmanly. Kavanaugh presented himself at one of the huts at John Clark's property on the evening of July 11th. On July 15th, Kavanaugh was brought to Hobart Town, attended by an escort. He was described as being emaciated and suffering from acute pain. With his arm in a sling, he was tried on the Thursday, the 7th of September 1843. The charge related to only one single incident, and that incident was the robbing of the Launceston coach near Epping Forest on July the 3rd. He was charged with having feloniously and violently put in bodily fear James Hewitt, the coach driver, and from his person taken 1 watch and 7 promissory notes of the value of £1 each. He pleaded not guilty and was refused counsel. When Kavanaugh was asked if he had anything to say to the jury, he asserted that he had fled from Port Arthur at the hazard of his life, being that it was a place where men were treated worse than dogs, and where it was almost impossible to live. He said, among other things that demonstrated much about his moral compass, that he had never committed any barbarous acts, nor violence on the female sex. The jury retired for only a few minutes and brought in a verdict of guilty. On their own, Cash and Jones remained in seclusion for a fortnight after Kavanaugh's surrender. Jones was concerned that Kavanaugh would inform on them. On the other hand, Cash was sure he wouldn't. Despite the risk, they decided to go to Cobb's Hill. They observed the house before busting in. Cash's confidence in Kavanaugh had been well placed. Cash and Jones stopped the mail coach between Jericho and Spring Hill in the early hours of Monday morning, August 14, 1843. They spent about an hour going through the mail. In late August, Hannah Blackburn informed Cash that there was talk that his wife, Eliza, was cohabitating with another man, Joseph Pratt. Cash informed Jones that he intended to visit his wife. Jones agreed to meet him at the Dromedary on his return. Cash travelled to Hobart Town with the intention of confronting Eliza and Pratt. Eliza's house was under police surveillance. On the 29th of August 1843, Cash was recognised by a constable in Brisbane Street when he asked a special constable for directions, and he was captured after a small shootout, which resulted in the death of a constable. Cash's trial was held over 2 days, beginning on September 6th, the day before Kavanaugh stood trial. On September the 23rd, 1843, it was reported that Jones was sighted in Launceston. It would seem that he was recognised by a constable, and a hot pursuit followed, without success. Jones established a new base camp at Mount Dromedary when he met up with 2 other convicts who had absconded from a road gang, Frederick Moore and James Platt. Moore, born in about 1818, convicted in Upper Canada for desertion from the army and was sentenced to 14 years. He was transported in November 1837 aboard the Moffat, arriving in Van Diemen's Land on the 1st of April 1838. Platt was convicted at Lancaster County, Lancashire, in the Liverpool Quarter Sessions and sentenced to 7 years transportation. He arrived in December 1836 aboard the Francis Charlotte. He went to Van Diemen's Land on the 14th of May 1837. On the 29th of... These men had absconded from a convict road gang on the 29th of November 1843. The 3 escaped convicts formed a gang and were ready to take up arms, which Jones was able to supply. Jones and his new gang appeared at Field Swamp Inn in late December 1843. The servants were tied up. On the night of Monday the 22nd of January 1844, Jones and gang robbed the home of Mr. Howell on the Shannon River in central Tasmania. They left with provisions and a number of guns and pistols. Around 8 o'clock in the evening of the 14th of February 1844, Jones, Platt and Moore arrived at the home of William Campbell at the Blackbrush Inn, near Brighton. Mr. Campbell and 2 men in the house had their hands and feet bound, and the Bushrangers demanded money. The captives claimed that there was none, and so Jones took the domestic servant, Harriet Devereux, to a bedroom to search for it. But he only found around £1 and 6 shillings in a snuff box. Jones was, however, convinced that there was more money somewhere in the house. So he heated a spade in the fire and laid it on Devereux's calves, causing blisters on her legs. On his second attempt to heat the spade, the handle got burnt and the blade dropped off. Jones untied the housekeeper and ordered her to prepare a supper for him and his companions. Jones, Platt and Moore remained at the house for around 2 hours. In the evening of the 24th of February 1844, Jones, Moore and Platt held up the Quested family at Brushy Plains. As well as taking things from the house, the 3 bushrangers also robbed the cart of George Taylor, a hawker, that was staying the night at the house. A 60-year-old man by the name of Thomas Blackburn was tried and found guilty in April of 1844 for receiving stolen goods. The goods had been stolen from Taylor's cart by Jones and his companions. Blackburn was sentenced to 14 years' imprisonment. Saturday the 9th of March, in the evening, the 3 bushrangers arrived at the Wheat Sheaf Hotel on the Richmond Road and held up Samuel Evans, the landlord, his wife and others at the hotel. Somehow Samuel managed to escape and went to the police. The bushrangers made off with some money, bottles of spirits, as well as other things. The police received a tip that the bushrangers were being harboured in a hut near Richmond belonging to a farmer named Isaac Alder. 19th of March 1844, Constable James Wild and Benjamin Cutler and 2 others were observing the hut from a distance, watching the goings-on in the house. District Constable Morton became convinced that bushrangers were in the hut, and so he and his men approached. Morton called out, "Bushrangers in the hut, let every man come out unarmed." Alder came out of his house in an attempt to convince the police that there were no bushrangers inside. Soon afterwards a shot was fired from the window of the hut. Dowling, Milligan, and James Brown then emerged from the house and was taken into custody. There was exchange of shots. Jones was hit, his face and head peppered with small shot. Jones, bleeding about the head, came out of the hut and lay down about 20 yards away. The bushrangers who remained inside asked if they would allow a woman to come out, but Morton refused, unless they would all first lay down their arms. Morton then ordered his men to set fire to the thatched roof. The bushrangers asked Morton again if he would allow a woman to come out. He again refused. The people in the house threw out their arms and ammunition. Frederick Moore emerged from the building and walked away, refusing to stop when ordered. Moore was shot by Constable Henry Davis. James Platt and Bridget Brown then came out of the hut. The prisoners were taken to Richmond Jail. On the following day, Jones and Platt were transferred to Hobart Town. Moore, it would seem, had fatal injuries. Before he died, Moore made a deposition. He died from his wounds on March 24th at Richmond Jail. In the Hobart Supreme Court on Tuesday the 16th of April, George Jones and James Platt were tried for their crimes, which included the injuries that Harriet Devereux had received, and putting her in bodily fear of her life. After only half an hour, the jury returned with a guilty verdict. On April 17th, George Jones was tried again, but this time it was for shooting William Jackson at Captain Samuel Horton's house near Ross in July 1843. The following day, Thursday the 18th of April 1844, Isaac Older, Isaac Dowley, William Milligan, James Brown, and Bridget Brown were tried with having feloniously harboured, concealed, sheltered, and protected the Bushrangers Jones and Platt. The case was mostly based on the deposition that Moore had made while he lay dying in jail. There was a great deal of debate over whether his deposition was admissible. In the end, only Elder and Dowley were found guilty. On Monday, April 22nd, the Chief Justice, John Petter, and Justice Montague reconsidered the admission of Moore's deposition in the cases of Alder and Dowling. Montague expressed his regret that it was used in evidence. The two judges concluded that the court should recommend both prisoners for a free pardon. On Friday, the 19th of April 1844, Jones and Platt were once again in court, this time being tried for having feloniously fired at Constable Benjamin Cutler on March 19 at Alder's house, with intent to kill and murder him. They were found guilty. Justice Montague asked the prisoners if they had anything to say as to why they should not be adjudged to die for their crimes. Jones made a long statement to the court asking that consideration be given to the deplorable situation in which he was now reduced, in which, due to his injuries, he was utterly incapable of seeing anything around him. Jones added he had been placed in this situation of an outlaw, but he had committed no murder, nor had he ever violated the chastity of females. He had always particularly and most carefully avoided shedding blood. Platt did not make a statement. The two men were sentenced to death. The judge described them as being of the vilest and worst description. He said he would not be recommending that the executive government spare their lives, and advised them to consider their hours numbered, and, when they were conveyed to their miserable cells, to send for the clergyman and kneel down and beg that pardon of God which in this world could not be awarded to them. While waiting for his execution in the Hobart Town Jail, Jones shared a cell with Martin Cash. In confidence, he apparently revealed that the sight in one of his eyes was partially restored. George Jones and James Platt were hung on the morning of 30th of April 1844, in front of a large crowd. Jones, it seemed, was very penitent, praying all the time, and with much apparent fervour, while Platt met his fate with the dogged indifference which characterised his demeanour in the Supreme Court. At noon on Friday the 15th of September 1843, the court convened in order for Justice Montague to pass sentence on a number of prisoners, including Lawrence Kavanaugh and Martin Cash. The court, closely thronged with spectators, after a lengthy address on the subjects of the crimes committed by the two men, during which Cash interjected on a number of occasions, the judge passed sentence of death on both Cash and Kavanaugh. Reverend Terry presented a petition to Lieutenant Governor Sir John Eardley Wilmot on the day following their sentence, praying that their lives may be spared Lawrence Kavanagh's reprieve was granted soon afterwards. He was then moved to the penitentiary. The report of Kavanagh's reprieve in the Courier newspaper was scathing. The life of this miserable and criminal creature has been spared at the moment when death was apparently his only hope. Shortly afterwards, Cash also received a reprieve. Both Kavanagh and Cash had their sentences commuted to transportation for life. The process commenced of transferring the administration of the Norfolk Island penal settlement from New South Wales to the government of Van Diemen's Land early in 1844. A new commandant, Joseph Childs, had arrived on the island in February 1844. In late April 1844, 100 desperate offenders, including Kavanagh, were put on board the Lady Franklin for transportation to Norfolk Island. On the news of the departure of the Lady Franklin, the Colonial Times newspaper observed, "The colony has been relieved of a considerable number of the most incorrigible of the prisoners, where we learn the worse than death system has recommenced in all its glory." As was normal over the history of the island, the convicts held on Norfolk Island at this time were made up of doubly convicted colonial prisoners, including bushrangers, cattle thieves, robbers, and those convicted of piracy in the colony, and those that had been sentenced to transportation for 15 years or life in the United Kingdom. There were men known as flashmen of the settlement who displayed extreme contempt for authority and scorned punishment that was meted out. In a report dated December 1844, Kavanagh was reported as behaving well. He had been appointed overseer to a number of sick persons on the island, and hitherto his conduct had been most exemplary. Martin Cash arrived at Norfolk Island in February 1844 aboard the brig Governor. Cash and all the other prisoners from the ship were marched to the barracks yard, where preliminaries were done. Afterwards they were taken to the lumber yard. It was surrounded by high walls, with a wooden cookhouse and a mess room to one side. It was here that Cash was once again reunited with his former companion, Kavanagh. But before too long, Kavanagh and Cash had a tiff. The rebellion at Norfolk Island has become known as the Cooking Pot Uprising or the Cooking Pot Riot. The cause of the riot goes back to the commandant of the penal settlement, Captain Macanucci. As he regarded his prisoners as human beings, he had permitted them to grow sweet potato and other vegetables in small garden plots. He had granted holidays, shortened the working day, and provided pots and kettles for prisoners to cook food. The colonial prisoners normally used these pots to prepare meals which they ate in the lumber yard. Under the order of Major Joseph Childs, the new commandant of the penal settlement, William Foster, superintendent of colonial prisoners, ordered the collection and removal of all cooking vessels from the lumber yard on the 30th of June 1846. This was carried out in the evening after the prisoners were locked in their barracks. The next morning the turnout bell rang and the men assembled in the barracks for prayer. They were then marched, accompanied by Patrick Hinney, Assistant Superintendent of Convicts, to the lumber yard, where they would usually cook their breakfast. Amongst the convicts was the men of the ring, the elite set of hardened criminals, and a group which dominated the other prisoners, and were contemptuous of the guards and overseers who supervised them day to day. Some men of this group surrounded Heine and complained that the kettles and cooking pots had been taken away. Heine left the group and went to the nearby cookhouse and told the overseer, Stephen Smith, he thought trouble was brewing. When Heine returned, he noticed that many more prisoners were in an agitated state. Heine approached the former bushranger, William Westwood. Westwood and the surrounding body of prisoners hurried from the lumber yard and made their way to the convict barracks store and recovered the cooking utensils. According to Cash, Kavanaugh was one of those who broke open the door of the store and took possession of the tin kettles. There was a short period of calm as the men returned to the lumber yard and began to prepare their breakfast. Someone yelled out, "Come on, we will kill the blank," and a group of men led by Westwood began grabbing pieces of wood and axes and ran for the gates of the lumber yard. William Westwood was then reported to have shouted, "Come on, you blank. Follow me and you will follow to the gallows." About 60 of the men rushed out of the lumber yard following Westwood, while the rest of the prisoners remained in the yard, aware of the risks of getting involved. As a result of the uprising, 4 men died. These men were convict constable John Morris, killed by Westwood with an axe blow to his head while he was stationed by his hut at the gate. At that time, 2 other constables were knocked to the ground by the mob. Stephen Smith, the free overseer, was brutally murdered, being beaten about the head and stabbed several times with a large carving fork. He left a wife and 3 children. Thomas Saxton, a convict constable, was killed by a blow to the head, and John Dinan, a convict constable, was killed by 2 savage axe blows. Fielding Brown, the new judge, departed from Hobart Town for Norfolk Island on September 3rd. By this stage, the prisoners believed to be the major participants or ringleaders were identified. They numbered 14. William Westwood, John Davies, Samuel Kenyon, Dennis Pentegard, Owen Comuski, Henry Whiting, William Pearson, James Cairns, William Pickthorne, Lawrence Kavanaugh, John Morton, William Lloyd, William Scrimshaw, and Edward McGuinness. Martin Cash, who had witnessed the events, later wrote that even though his old friend was one of those who earlier broke into the store and retrieved the cooking pot, Kavanaugh took no part in the subsequent murderous events, as he was down by the creek at the rear of the lumberyard at the time these occurred. Cash claimed that Kavanaugh was falsely accused by a prisoner known as Dog Kelly, who had a grudge against him for a perceived insult. Kelly took advantage of the opportunity now offered to resent the insult which existed in his mind by swearing that Kavanaugh was one of Westwood's party. Cash added the comment, "At this time, an innocent was just as likely to suffer as a guilty one." The trial of the 14 men commenced on the 23rd of September 1846. In the end, 12 of the accused were found guilty and sentenced to hang. 2 of the 14, John Morton and William Lloyd, were acquitted. Before he was executed, William Westwood declared as a dying man to Reverend Rogers that 4 of the 12 condemned men, Kavanaugh, Whiting, Pickthorne, and Scrimshaw, were innocent of the charges. Westwood was reported to have claimed, "I never spoke to Kavanaugh on the morning of the riot, and those other 3 men had no part in the killing of John Morris, as far as I know." The executions were carried out on the morning of Tuesday, the 13th of October, 1846, in 2 batches of 6. The gallows were erected in front of the new jail, the structure of the scaffolding consisting of 2 beams, from which the ropes were hung. with trapdoors that fell from each side of the centre. The first 6 men executed at 8 o'clock were Westwood, Davis, Pickthorne, Kavanaugh, Kamusky, and McGuinness. An armed force of 30 soldiers were in attendance, and the executions were supervised by Captain Blatchford, Superintendent of Convicts. At 10 o'clock the remaining 6 prisoners were hanged. After each set of executions, the bodies were placed in rough wooden coffins, loaded onto 2 bullock carts, and taken to a disused saw pit outside the cemetery, where they were buried. The location of their burials is on unconsecrated ground outside the cemetery fence, and it is known as Murderer's Mound. Cash later became a trustee and then a constable. He married Mary Burnett, a domestic servant, on the 24th of March 1854. He was granted a ticket of leave later that year. Between 1854 and 1856, he was an overseer in the Royal Hobart Botanical Garden. He had 1 child, a son, Martin, born in 1855. Subsequently, he travelled to Christchurch, New Zealand, where it was rumoured that during the approximately 4 years that Cash lived in New Zealand, he kept several brothels. He became a free man in 1863, returned to Tasmania. Cash is one of the few bushrangers to die of old age. He died in his bed in Amiens Avenue, Glenorchy, in 1877. During the late 1860s, he had dictated his autobiography to a scribe, James Lester Burke. While this account is quite embellished, it does provide some insight into convict life. Cash was his legacy. He was quite unique amongst the notorious bushrangers in dying an honourable death, aged nearly 70 as a free man. His memoirs were later transcribed by Buck and Joan Emberg and released under the title The Uncensored Story of Martin Cash. Cash Court in Austin's Ferry is named after the bushranger and his farm. There is also a Cash's Cave near Magra in the Derwent Valley. The Martin Cash Motel in Derwent Park is another tribute with the bushranger's name up in neon lights. And so that's the end of the Cash and Co story. I hope you enjoyed this addition to Convict Diaries, and I hope you'll join me again next time when we do some more entries into the Convict Diaries. Thank you. Bye.